Winter. The days get shorter and darker. The air gets heavier. The world prepares for slumber. But danger lurks in the cold. It watches from the shadows, waiting for its prey to set foot beyond the veil.
Really quickly before we get into today's episode, I'd like to talk to you about Zach's new horror anthology that's coming out very soon. It is called Hibernator, Stories for the Long Sleep. Winter. The days get shorter and darker. The air gets heavier. Isolation, starvation, anguish, rest. How can the old haunts of the cold be revisited? Hibernator is a winter horror anthology that features 9 authors and 9 different sleepy snow stories, ranging from cosmic to folk, southern gothic to psychological. Hibernator ties together some of the best voices in horror, featuring Mike Salt, Nick Boltic, Jennifer Osborne, D.E. McCluskey, C.F. Page, Richard Beauchamp, Micah Castle, Jason Halls, and Zach Graham. Hibernator is the first annual anthology offered by Brace Books, inspired by the cask of Amontillado and At the Mountains of Madness. Pre-orders are now available. It's coming December 5th. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up, I spent most of my summers threading between the towering pines and oaks of our state's backcountry, losing myself in the whispers of the wind and chatter of unseen critters. My father used to say I had bark for skin and sap for blood, and maybe he wasn't too far off. Even when life tugged me into the clamor of city living, concrete towers and neon glares that had no memory of starlight, I found my way back to those woods, those sanctuaries that whispered secrets older than any of us. Personally, I hated bringing people with me though. Not every time, obviously, but damn, nothing is better than roughing it all by yourself. I've had experiences when I was younger, bringing friends along with me just to have them complain about their problems the whole time, or get too drunk, or do some other undesirable shit. I had a consistent area that I've been using for years, and I didn't want to spoil it by showing it to somebody who would abuse it, so for the most part, I went alone. It was during one of those long stretches, a 3-day holiday weekend to be precise, when I decided to go deeper than I ever had before. I'd seen it once, a blue eye of a lake nestled in the crux of a canyon, far off the beaten path. I'd had a few conversations with local outdoor buffs, and confirmed it was real, a hidden treasure that only a handful knew about. Maps spread out on my kitchen table, packs stuffed with the essentials, and a buzz of excitement prickling underneath my skin. I set off early on a Friday morning. The road turned to dirt long before I reached the valley itself. My tires bounced over rocks and dry ruts, dust pluming in around me, and it seemed like I was driving through a fog of my own making. The air down here had a different flavor, earthy and damp, layered with scents of wildflowers and decay. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to bend inward, as if they were watching and waiting. It took me another hour of navigating narrow paths, eyes flickering between the GPS and the ever-thickening forest, before I finally found a clearing. The sun glanced off the grass in these golden waves, and in the distance, just past a slope of oak trees, I caught the shimmer of the lake. Up top, before the road dipped into the canyon that I was in, there were campers all over. Down here, I only saw 1 or 2 other campers set up, and they looked really rugged outdoorsy types. Questionable trucks and questionable towing methods for the trailers. Hell, I couldn't believe they even tried to get their equipment down there like that. Real pros that apparently knew the area themselves. I set up my camp far away from them with this practiced ease. Tent pegged taut, hammock strung between two ancient oak trees, and a small ring of rocks for my fire. I laid back in my hammock, letting the gentle sway and the soft rustle of the leaves lull me into a stupor. The warmth of the afternoon seeped deep into my skin, and before I knew it, the sky was blushing with the first strokes of twilight. I startled up awake, and the air now tinged with a chill that smelled of loam and shadow. Time to get to work. I napped for far too long than I intended to, and I still had a lot to do to get my camp set up. I'm kind of a big doomsday prepper, not really in my lifestyle, but when I do my outdoor activities, so I always expect the worst. This means I gather lots of wood, secure the area, make sure my food is stashed properly, and my truck isn't wasting any battery, all that kind of stuff. I gathered firewood, straying from clearing to clearing and zigzagging through the brush, arms filled with sticks and dry branches. The ground crunched underneath my boots, a rhythmic counterpoint to the sporadic chirps of crickets waking up for the night. Just beyond the thicket, I reached a spot where the trees parted, giving me a view of the lake. The water was as smooth as glass, catching the last slivers of sunlight and painting them in these streaks of molten orange. The rim of the canyon above darkened, swallowing the last rays and leaving the valley cloaked in this velvety blue. It was beautiful. It was isolating. It was heaven. I was so happy to find this little slice of wilderness all for me. I gathered the last that I could and then turned back for my camp. The fire caught easily, flames licking up hungrily, cracking as if in celebration. I sat back and skewered a couple of hot dogs and turned them slowly, savoring the way the fire's heat warmed up my face. Beans bubbled up in a tin at the edge of the flame. The scent itself was comforting, but also foretelling of what my tent would smell like later that night. I took my time eating, chewing each bite as the dark thickened around the stars and unfurled like pinpricks of ice. I loved eating like shit out in these woods. It was the only time I let myself eat really junk food. The first sign that something was off, though, came quietly. A rustle barely perceptible at the edge of the firelight. I glanced up, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a coyote nosing about the underbrush. Instead, I saw a shape, a small figure just at the edge where the light met the dark. He was a boy, no more than 7, barefoot and disheveled, eyes that caught the flicker of the flames like twin mirrors. "Can I warm up by your fire?" he asked me, voice thin and careful, like the question might break if spoken too loudly. My mouth went dry, words tangled up in my throat. Who was he? Where had he come from? The nearest road was miles and miles away, but my shock stilled me, and before I could think to say anything else, I nodded. "Of course," I managed, gesturing to the other side of the fire. "Are you lost, kid?" He shook his head, the corners of his mouth tilting up in a smile that was both too old and too young at the same time. "No, my family's camped down here. I was just coming back from the lake. I thought this was our camp." My eyes swept to the dark, searching for the faint glow of another fire, the distant hum of voices, but there was nothing. The woods swallowed up like a glutton. I forced myself to keep the conversation going, though, my heart kicking against my ribs slowly. "It's late," I said, more to myself than him. "It's dark. Aren't you getting worried about getting turned around out here?" He looked at me, eyes unblinking. "Doesn't really matter down here. The trails are always the same." Something about the way he said that just made my skin prickle. The flames cracked, spitting embers, and I flinched. He was right, but damn, it was creepy coming from a 7-year-old. Reminded me of Children from the Corn or something. "Do you have any more hot dogs?" he asked. With ketchup? I swallowed. The absurdity of the request made my brain stutter a little bit. But again, I found myself nodding, forcing my hands steady as I speared another hot dog and held it over the fire. The kid didn't move. He didn't even seem to blink, just watched me with those reflective eyes. I wrapped the hot dog in tin foil and handed it across the fire. He took it with a polite nod and a soft thank you before turning and slipping back into the dark, away from the direction of the lake, away from any path that I currently knew. Then he stopped at the edge of the light and turned around. Did I have another one? He was bold, but I couldn't deny him though. I quickly prepped a second hot dog, wrapped it in a bun and put some ketchup on it just like the first, and then sent him on his way. He thanked me once more and then went off into the woods. My eyes followed him, straining against the dark until I saw it. The pale shapes of other people, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Indistinct, but definitely there, watching. One shifted and I saw the glint of an eye, the soft movement of a head tilting. They stood like shadows, silent and waiting. My breath caught and I nearly called out, but my voice shriveled up in my throat. As suddenly as they appeared, they melted back into the dark, the forest swallowing them without so much as a rustle. I stayed there, rigid, my eyes darting between the trees and the fire, heart pounding with a staccato rhythm in my chest. Minutes blended into hours, the fire burning down to glowing coals while I sat guard, unable to shake the image of those silent watchers. Eventually, exhaustion weighed in on me like lead, and my eyes started to droop shut. I crawled into my tent and let sleep take me for good. The morning came in a rush of light and bird calls. I blinked awake, muscles stiff and mind heavy with the fog of restless dreams. The clearing itself looked unchanged, peaceful even, as if the night before had been nothing but a fevered trick of the dark. But the footprints, small and pressed into the soft dirt by the fire, told me otherwise. I spent that morning scouring the area, looking for any sign of where the boy might have gone to. When I didn't find anything, I made my way to a nearby camp that I passed by on the way in. It was a couple, weathered and friendly, sat by their own fire, sipping on steaming cups of instant coffee. Sorry to bother you folks, but did you guys happen to see a kid last night? Their faces darkened, glances fitting to each other's before the woman answered. Yeah, we did. He came by asking for food, barefoot. We ended up giving him some granola bars. A cold coil of dread tightened up in my gut. Did you happen to see anybody else? The man nodded, slowly. The shapes, though, people out there in the woods. Too many for comfort. I compared notes with the couple for a bit and told them that same weird thing had happened to me the night before, and I just couldn't place what or why or even how. Who the hell was living down here with the first grader? We decided to let the authorities know. The ranger who came by later had this look in his eyes that suggested he'd heard this all before. We have had reports, he said, shifting uneasily, and a story going around about a family living down here, hiding out. Maybe on the run, but no one's gotten close enough to figure it all out. Fishermen said they see a kid on shore of the lake every single weekend. I spent the rest of my weekend on edge after making the call. Every crackle of a branch or rustle of leaves sharpening my nerves. I saw him again, the boy, from a distance. He stood on the slope just above the lake, watching me, eyes glittering even in the light of day. This time, there was no smile, just emptiness that, I'll admit, chilled me. There were shapes too, the people, his family maybe, stood further up the hill. Their stillness, even more unnerving than his. They all looked young, but their energy was all off, and I had no interest in getting caught looking at them again. On the last morning of my trip, I packed up and left, the forest closing the door behind me, and I dared not open it again. I didn't end up going back to that spot, Not once, or at least not to that exact area. Regardless, when I'm camping and the night presses close and the wind moves my tent, I still think about that boy and those silent watchers who seem stitched into the darkness themselves. Often I wonder to myself, they're still down there, and the place with the trails are always the same. It was the summer of 2018 when I'd bought my van. This clunky, steel gray home on wheels that promised freedom inside its simplicity. I knitted it out with everything that I needed. A bedroll, a small kitchen setup, a solar-powered heater, and a robust external lighting system. For over a year, I crisscrossed the country, embracing the call of towering redwoods, quiet deserts, and roaring rivers. But nothing would prepare me for the night that everything changed. It was spring of 2019. I was winding through the untamed backcountry of Colorado, far from the paved roads of civilization. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth, and a cool breeze sifted through the cracked window as my tires crunched over the gravel roads. I'd heard whispers from other travelers about this off-map trail that promised solitude and breathtaking vistas, and I wanted to experience them for myself. By late afternoon, I emerged from a canopy of dense forest and into a clearing and saw, to my surprise, a tiny settlement nestled there. It wasn't marked on any map. A collection of weather-beaten houses, a small chapel with peeling white paint, and a country store stood crookedly, like the last sentinels of some kind of forgotten time. The store had one half closed up, and the other half was emblazoned with a neon open sign that buzzed faintly, barely even visible in the waning light. I slowed my van down, curiosity nibbling at the edges of my caution. The bar side of the store glowed warmly, and a few muffled voices trickled out of the door once it creaked open and then shut again. A man in a tattered hat glanced my way, eyes catching the reflection of my headlights before disappearing back inside. The presence of the township was oddly disquieting, but the voice of reason assured me it was nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, clinging to survival. Better keep going, I muttered to myself. Don't want to hear any banjos. The road twisted and snaked for another 15 minutes, dipping into pockets of shadow where the forest loomed close. The setting sun painted the worlds in strokes of orange and red, casting long fingers of darkness between the trees. When I finally found a clearing to park in, it was just shy of twilight. The space was perfect though, open enough to spot any wildlife, with a dense copse of pines for shelter on one side. I shut off my engine, leaving the headlights on as I prepped the space outside. My camp came to life, the sizzle of steak in the pan, the crackle of the portable heater, and the rhythmic clicks of utensils on metal. The light cast by my van splashed over the clearing, creating these sharp contrasts that reached deep into the woods. My external lighting system put floodlights to shame. I wanted to be able to light up a whole area with nothing but the click of a button. Forget the creepy shadows of a campfire. This was the modern era of solo camping, stovetop cooking, and light beams warded away any critters. With dinner now finished and everything secured, I stood there, savoring in the isolation. Night had now swept over the landscape like a dark shroud, and the stars above me felt unnervingly close. I stretched, feeling the chill seep in through my flannel shirt, and then relieved myself by a nearby tree before climbing back into my van. Nothing worse than buttoning in for the night and then realizing you have to pee, let all the warm air out. My speaker whispered this soft tune, the voice of an artist mingling with the whisper of the wind. I had this nice little speaker system in the back of the van for tunes or podcasts. It was my comfort and my entertainment when I wanted to relax or just fall asleep. Hours passed by inside the comfort of my tiny home. I read from a dog-eared paperback, then switched to a true crime podcast. Then I drifted off to sleep with the heater's warmth cocooning me in. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up abruptly. My senses were sharpened to this razor's edge. Silence draped the world outside, so suffocatingly thick that it felt unnatural. Crunch. A footstep. No, two. My breath caught as the sound of shuffling and metallic scrapes reached my ears. I sat up with my heart thudding and peered out my window. The clearing was bathed in this pale moonlight, but what I saw tightened my chest with fear. Small beams of light cut through the darkness, jerking and bouncing, as if wielded by restless hands. Figures moved just beyond my vision. Their movements were erratic, almost inhuman. I wished in the moment I'd left my external lights on at this point, but they were a real battery sucker. My skin prickled as I spotted one of the shadows pause and then point their flashlights straight at the van. The beam hit the window, glaring through, and I ducked reflexively. My mind spun with possibilities. Teenagers? Hunters? But what kind of hunter roots around an occupied campsite? That makes no sense. I reached for my boots and put them on, strapping my belt tight and then pulling out the large hunting knife from its sheath. Every nerve screamed for action, but I forced myself to stay silent. I crept to the side door and tested the handle. Locked. Confusion twisted my thoughts. I didn't lock it from the outside. Why couldn't I open it? The shiver traced my spine as another flashlight swept across the side window. This time, it lingered, revealing a pair of eyes glistening and wild, framed by a face that almost seemed skeletal, had sunken cheeks and cast these long shadows. The beam quickly shifted again, blinding me, and I recoiled instinctively. "Hey!" I shouted, breaking the taut silence. My voice cracked and raw with fear. "Get away from here, I'm armed!" I got no response. The only reply was the low murmuring of voices outside, words slipping away into the wind. I stumbled backwards, clutching my knife so hard that my knuckles were turning white. My phone, where is it? I lunged for it, unlocking the screen with my shaking fingers, only to see the no service indicator glaring at me almost mockingly. I checked my back door and it too was sealed shut. A metallic click echoed from above, and I looked up, eyes wide as the overhead hatch swung open with an unnatural creak. Cold air now rushed in. There was a sound like a coin being flipped repeatedly, a metallic ringing that sent a chill down my spine. My pulse was pounding so loudly I could hear it drumming in my ears. So, somebody had locked me inside my van from the outside, and they were forcing me to exit through the roof hatch. Beyond sketchy. I remember sweating right through my clothes, but shivering at the same time, almost like I was going through some kind of withdrawal. The hatch hovered open above me, gaping like a mouth. A voice deep within me screamed at me not to look, not to risk meeting whatever stared back from that void. The seconds stretched off into eternity. Then, with sudden violence, the hatch snapped shut, shaking the roof of the van. There were no footsteps up there, which creeped me out even more. I swallowed a scream and peeked out the side window. The figures were now on the move again, lights bobbing like fireflies in a mad dance. Only now they were sprinting, dashing back into the forest towards the distant township, I believe. Their retreat was a frenzy, beams flickering in this crazy pattern that made the shadows lurch and shudder. Honestly, there was so much movement that it didn't even look like people, nor even flashlights. I couldn't tell what they looked like. Gritting my teeth, I tried the side door handle once more, and this time it clicked open. The cool air then rushed in, filled with a sharp scent of pine and something else, something metallic and sour. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold, and scanned the scene. Everything that I left out was in disarray. Plates overturned, a pot rolled into the brush, but nothing was taken. The dirt around the van bore deep, curving impressions, like something heavy had been erected or impressed. My heart faltered at the thought of what kind of ritual or game could leave such a mark. Enough of this, I muttered to myself. My hands were shaking with frantic precision as I packed everything back into the van, slamming each door shut. I was not about to wait around for another round of this eerie dance. Within minutes, the headlights sliced through the blackness as I turned the van around, speeding deeper into the forest, past those trees that stood like silent judges. I drove for nearly an hour, tires skidding over unseen potholes and roots, my mind racing with images of hollowed-eyed figures and strange metallic sounds. When I finally stopped, my breath came in these ragged gasps. The night was silent again, and exhaustion swept over me, heavy as a lead blanket. I didn't head for town. I was going deeper into the woods. Believe it or not, isolation, wilderness, that was my biggest security and my biggest defense. The further I could get away from those people, the safer I would be. I locked every door and checked them twice, then collapsed into my bedroll, knife clutched in my hand. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted with the smallest noises, the wind brushing leaves, the creak of the van settling in on its wheels. Morning brought weak light filtered in through those pines. My body ached with tension as I stepped outside to inspect my van once more. The chill of the night had given way to a still eerie calm, but what I saw, I couldn't comprehend. Around the van, the same patterns as before, these deep impressions, only this time they were fresher, clearer, and too perfectly spaced to be random. I ran a shaking hand over the marks, the cold seeping into my fingertips. There was something deliberate, almost ceremonial about them. My mind flitted back to the strange village, to those figures sprinting back towards in the dead of the night. I wanted to believe this is all a prank, a group of locals pulling a fast one on this helpless stranger, but deep down I wasn't sure. The impressions in the dirt seemed to almost mock me with their silence. My mind raced with questions that refused to resolve into any sense. What ritual left these sort of marks, and who were those people? Was it some kind of cult? Was it an ancient practice that outsiders like me would never fully understand? The answer eluded me, dancing at the edge of reason. I snapped a few pictures of the impressions with my phone, a futile attempt that reassured myself that I wasn't losing my mind fully. The morning sun crept higher, its light offering a meager sense of security. But daylight was this thin comfort now. The memories of last night still clung to me like a skunk spray. With a sigh of defeat, I resolved back towards civilization. I drove until I reached the next real town, a place bustling with people and mundane lives that seemed so distant from the terror that I'd just experienced the night prior. The diner I pulled into buzzed with the morning chatter and the clink of cutlery against ceramic. The smell of bacon and coffee was a balm to my frayed nerves. A waitress with very kind eyes approached me, notepad at the ready. I ordered some coffee, my voice still rough from the sleepless night. When she returned with the cup, I couldn't help myself. I leaned forward, the words spilling out before I could even stop myself. Have you ever heard of a settlement, maybe 30 miles northeast of here? Small, with a chapel and a store. Her face changed immediately. The warmth in her expression bottomed out like somebody pulled the drain plug. She glanced at the older man sitting at the counter, who caught her look and frowned himself. Shouldn't be going out that way, the man said, turning to me fully now. His weathered face was serious, and you could tell this was no bullshit. What do you mean? The man's lips thinned, and he seemed to weigh his words carefully in the moment. That place, it's not on any map for a reason. Folks around here don't go there. Old stories say it's bad mojo. Some people say that it used to be a mining town until something drove everybody away. People get sick living out there. I swallowed, feeling the knot of dread coil tighter inside my gut. Last night, I saw... My voice cracked, and I had to take a breath before continuing. There were people there. With flashlights, they were surrounding my van, moving in these strange patterns. They looked... I hesitated. How could I explain eyes that seemed to see right through me, or the unnatural way that they moved? I didn't need another warning. I left the diner without finishing my coffee, hands still shaking as I turned the ignition of the van and pointed it south, away from the mountains, away from that nameless town and the horrors it kept buried. The road stretched on ahead of me, winding and endless, but I didn't stop until the landscape changed to familiar, populated areas. It was only when I parked outside a crowded supermarket, the chatter of ordinary people buzzing around me, that I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply and relax. Never found out who those people were or why they haunted those woods, but those marks and that night stayed with me for long after, leaving almost a scar of the fabric in my wanderlust. Even now as I tell you this story, I feel sick, and I can hear those rhythmic scrapes of metal, almost like a coin being flipped endlessly inside the dark. I've always craved the thrill of pushing my body to its mind and its limit. Back in college, I was known among my friends for planning the kind of camping trips that most people would scoff at. Trips into icy storms, the shriek of the wind biting at every exposed inch of your skin. Or deep into snow-blanketed woods where silence reigned like a tyrant. Those adventures were born from afternoons spent with a rock climbing club, a motley crew of daredevils who thrived on the challenge of pairing physical exertion with bouts of extreme weather. For me, the harder the trip, the more accomplished I would feel when I made it out the other side, exhausted but exhilarated. It became an addiction of sorts, a badge of honor among us adrenaline seekers. So when the idea of camping in Death Valley during peak summer heat gripped me, it was only natural that I'd take it as an ultimate test. But I'm not foolish. I knew Death Valley could be lethal, so I decided on a series of practice runs in the lesser-known deserts along the Arizona and Utah borders first. These places were desolate, with nothing to offer but sand, scrub, and relentless heat. They would teach me the patience that I need to sharpen my survival techniques, build makeshift sunshades, learning the best methods to trap cool air, and testing how far I could push my water rations before my body would start to protest. It was during one of these trips that I found myself deeper in isolation than ever before, 60 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by a landscape that felt untouched by human hands. The sun blazed with its angry white in the sky as I set up my campsite. The heat shimmered in waves, painting the horizon in mirages that wavered and taunted my eyes. I spent hours practicing various ways to construct emergency shelters, digging shallow trenches to lie in, covered by tarps that I weighed down with rocks. Each bead of sweat that trickled down my neck seemed to hiss into nothingness as it touched the ground. By the time the sun began its slow descent, casting the sky in bands of orange and purple, I felt deep exhaustion in my bones, but also a sense of achievement. I decided to hike down into the nearby dry creek bed, hoping the lower elevation would be a fraction cooler. My boots crunched against the cracked earth, every step echoing into the expanse. And that's when I saw a pair of shoes, bright white under the waning sunlight, half buried in the sand. I frowned and stepped a little closer, curiosity gnawing at the edge of my exhaustion. The shoes were splattered with dark crusted stains as I prodded one of them with a stick. It rolled just enough for me to see that they were filled with this grotesque slurry of dried blood and unidentifiable fragments. My pulse spiked with a little adrenaline. The distant hum of cicadas seemed to swell to a shriek now. Animal attack, I told myself. Maybe a coyote or even a snake bite gone wrong. But there was this nagging whisper in my mind, telling me that didn't add up. Shoes that neatly placed, in a place so untouched and that much blood? The hell was inside of it? Toes? The sun sank further, and long dark shadows stretched across the sand, turning the once familiar landscape into something alien and unfathomable. It wasn't dark yet, but it would be in a couple of hours. I stood there for a few more moments, scanning the flat plains, looking for movement or signs of life. There was nothing though, only the wind brushing against the dry brush. I forced myself to finally turn away. My throat was tight, but I made my way back to camp. The ground felt less solid now underneath my feet, as if it might give way to reveal something hidden, something unspeakable, and something that might kill me. As I neared my tent, I saw more clothes scattered like debris along the path, snagged on thorny brushes and half covered by sand. A pair of jeans, a torn blouse, each one stained with that same telltale red-brown splatter. My heart sank and I broke into a run, skidding to a halt at my camp. My gear was still in place, untouched, but now I felt eyes on me, a pressure against the back of my neck that made the fine hair stand on end. It's this spooky, almost primal feeling. I spent the next hour securing everything I had. I made sure my tarp and tent stakes were tight, and the small reflective emergency blankets hidden from plain view. I had my flashlight ready, the .22 pistol loaded as well. I crouched low, listening to the silence that had swallowed the desert. No coyotes now, no flutter of wings, just an expanse of emptiness so deep it felt like it could consume me. I took another deep breath and grabbed my binoculars, climbed this short bluff that overlooked my basin. My legs trembled slightly as I ascended, muscles tight from the weariness of the day and tension of what I'd seen earlier. From that vantage point, I could scan the miles of cracked earth and pale shrubs with this meticulous care. The glass lenses cut through the afternoon glow, showing every bump and shadow. My gaze caught on something peculiar, I'd say about a mile out. A haphazard pile of shapes, strange enough to make me look twice. I squinted, adjusted the focus, and saw what appeared to be a chaotic scattering of clothes. Wigs, shoes, high heels, even makeup kits. All of them marked with that dark smear of blood. A shiver went through me, sweat freezing on my skin in spite of the heat. The breeze picked up slightly now, rustling the sparse vegetation. I swore it carried with it the faintest hint of decay. I lowered those binoculars and rubbed at my eyes, as if waking myself from some sort of nightmare. But when I looked again, that sight remained. The quiet around me was deafening now, pressing down until even my breath seemed like a betrayal. Whoever or whatever had left those things out there, it hadn't been the work of Mother Nature. I didn't know if it was the killer's discard pile or some grim shrine, but my instincts screamed at me to get out. I wandered out that direction to inspect what I'd saw through the glass, and sure enough, there was all kinds of women's belongings scattered for almost a mile. Dresses, shoes, dozens of fingernail extensions inside the sand. It was super weird and super creepy. The sun bled out over the horizon, leaving only a thin strip of deep red. Deep down, I knew I should leave now, while there was still enough light to make the drive easier, but my gear was just too scattered. The car was parked a ways off. Every instinct inside me told me not to make a mistake, and that would get me stranded inside the desert at night, so reluctantly, I decided to stay, if only I could gather my things at first light. I ended up building this small fire, more for comfort than anything else. Forced down some dehydrated food while keeping one eye on that expanse beyond me. The flames cast jittery orange shadows on the rocks and bush around me, flickering like warning signals. I doused the fire as soon as I could, wanting to stay hidden from view. I only needed it to warm the water for my dinner. I tucked into the shadows of my car in the brush, settled in with my pistol at my side and my ears straining to catch every whisper of the desert. I did some rearranging before sundown. I moved my camp really close to my car, or as much of it as I could. made my little makeshift fire pit far off from camp, so as to not totally give away my position in the dark. Once I was done eating and doused it out, I walked back to my car and hid out there. Hours passed by, fatigue nipping at the edges of my awareness, urging me to close my eyes, if only for a second. But then, faint and far, a voice echoed out across the basin, a long, drawn-out holler that twisted and warped as it reached me. My heart leapt out into my throat. Another voice joined it, shouting back. The sound too high-pitched and full of static to be natural, though. Was it drunk or delirious? The voices argued, spat curses that I couldn't quite make out, then erupted into peals of laughter that turned my stomach. They were close, maybe a mile or two at most, and moving. I gripped my pistol tight, hands sweating as I listened. The shouts rose and fell, moving across the landscape without any discernible path, until the growl of an engine shattered the stillness. A car screeched and spun in the distance, roaring away with a fury that made the echoes bounce between the cliffs. Then silence once more, thick and accusing. I could not wait for morning. My gut was tight with dread, and the idea of being found out here, isolated and alone, gnawed at my resolve. I scrambled to pack what I could in the moment, leaving behind what I didn't need. My fingers were numb and fumbling around. My car clock blinked at 3:02 a.m. as I pulled onto that dirt road, the beams of my headlights cutting weak, jagged paths through the dark. The road was pitted and rough, my teeth jarred with every mile, but I pressed the gas, wanting nothing more than to see the small lights of the nearest town. And then I saw headlights up ahead, bright and racing towards me from a side path. The shadow of a car behind them, moving fast, far too fast. I gritted my teeth and pushed harder on the accelerator. The landscape blurred at the edges of my vision. My pulse was pounding so hard, it could have been another engine. The headlights kept pace with me, a hunter's gleam in the rearview mirror, but the distance between us grew and grew as the road finally smoothed out. By the time I reached the intersection that marked the main highway, the lights behind me had now faded, swallowed up by the desert's maw. Dawn was just this pale line when I found a gas station with a flickering neon sign. As soon as I got a signal, I called the police, breathless, recounting every single detail I could. The shoes, the bloody clothes, the voices, the pursuit. The officer on the other end of the line was silent for a moment, then promised to send somebody out to check it. I sat in that parking lot as the sky warmed to pink, the hum of life all around me. But those questions never left. Who had been out there, and what had they done? I never found out if anything came from my report to the police, but I really hope it did. Everybody just tells me it was a dump site, but part of me struggles to accept that it really was. I've always found a kind of solace in the wild, a sense of freedom in the silence of the mountain ranges that stretches endlessly beyond the city's clamor. Those overnight backpacking trips were like a secret ritual. Leave work at dusk, drive out to the trailhead, hike up a peak, and settle inside the solitude underneath the stars. It was this unspoken bond between me and the wilderness, and it kept my mind sharp and my heart steady. I could feel my pulse sink to the soft murmur of the night winds, the steady chirping of the crickets, the occasional call of an owl. It was perfect. Each trip another page into a personal journal, written in sweat and starlight. That evening felt no different as any other as I set out for that new peak, one that I'd yet to mark on my map. The trailhead was deserted, its gravel lot holding only the evidence of countless travelers before me. The sky bled shades of crimson as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across that rugged landscape. It was the ideal start to an overnight adventure, the air crisp and full of anticipation. I was making pretty good time, my boots kicking up dust, my pack of familiar weight against my back. The mountain loomed ahead, its jagged edges glowing under that soft embrace of the twilight. By late afternoon, I could see the summit, a crown atop the rough spine of a rock. I reached a flat clearing at the base of a massive boulder, its surface streaked with these scars of time and weather. This would be my camp for the night, a lonely sentry above a sprawl of suburban lights, winking just a few miles below, closer than I was used to. The slide gave me pause. A neighborhood out there, its glow a smudge of neon on the ink black canvas of the desert. I pitched my tent, my fingers moving with the memory of a seasoned camper, and settled in for the night with a tin of beans and a protein bar. The moon, bloated and full, watched me from its throne high in the sky. I let the quiet seep into my bones. I put on a podcast to fill the void and leaned up against the cool, rough stone behind me. I drank most of a 12-pack as well. Somewhere far down the mountainside came the faint rumble of engines. I sat up, squinting out into the dark. 2, maybe 3 cars moved sluggishly across the desert floor, their headlights cutting swaths of brightness into the otherwise pitch-black night. I shrugged and leaned back. It wasn't uncommon for night drivers to take these paths, sometimes campers, sometimes teens out for a thrill. I pulled my fleece tighter. The gravelly voice from the podcast recounted some old ghost story, when a sharp sound sliced out through the night. A rapport, flat and echoey. Gunfire. My heart thumped, sudden and harsh as silence fell again, almost like a heavy curtain. I strained my eyes, searching the darkness, and saw it. A tiny flash, orange and wicked, like the blink of a predatory eye. Another flash. The rock behind me thudded dully as something struck it, sending pebbles skittering. Realization came in like a sickening wave. Those shots were aimed at my camp, at me. I dropped, chest heaving as I pressed myself hard against the ground. The night erupted with a cacophony of shots, the boulder behind me cracking and spitting shards of stone. Panic clawed at every part of me. I was expecting to take a round in the ass at any second now. I scrambled on all fours, dragging my body across to the other side of the rock, where the shadow pooled the deepest. The shots continued to ricochet, their echoes rolling up the mountain like thunder. Why were they shooting? Did they even know I was here? I pressed my face into the dirt, the air thick with dust and sweat, ears straining for any pause of the gunfire. When it finally came, a breathless hush blanketed the mountain. I didn't dare move. My pack, my water, my food, my phone, all sat within arm's reach on the other side of the boulder. I had to get to it. Adrenaline surged, pushed me into motion, and I quickly lunged, hands grasping for the canvas strap, fingers brushing the nylon as a new volley erupted. I yanked the bag back, bullets stitching the earth where I'd been moments before. The chaos was deafening, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. Crouched in the narrow space behind the boulder, I sucked in deep breaths, trying to quiet the jackhammer rhythm of my heartbeat. The gunfire stuttered, then halted, replaced by voices carried on the wind. Laughter. It was eerie and dissonant, mocking in a way that made my blood chill. I peered over the edge, risking a glance down the slope. The cars were still there, headlights washing the sands in this harsh white light. Figures began moving in the glow, their silhouettes distorted by distance. I could see them waving guns, gesturing at the mountain, pointing at my refuge. I flattened as their voices rose again, words undistinguishable but filled with strange manic glee. I could not tell if they knew I was there or not, or if this was some kind of grotesque game that they were playing, out underneath the indifferent gaze of the moon. Hours passed by, time stretching painfully, as I counted each beat between the shots, each moment of fragile quiet. The night was alive with distant shouts, the metallic clink of gun barrels, the sharp hiss of whispers, too close to the surface of my sanity. I couldn't risk a fire, couldn't risk moving an inch beyond that boulder's shadow. Each second gnawed at my composure, stripping me of the confidence that had once carried me up to this peak. The winds now shifted, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and gunpowder. It made my throat close, fear a tangible, suffocating thing. Finally, that laughter drifted away, the sound unraveling into the dark until silence took its place. It was past midnight when I dared shift my position, muscles sore from holding still, my joints stiff and aching. Sleep was now out of the question. I waited out the hours, every minute a battle with my nerves. I couldn't look down without the image of that orange muzzle flash searing into my mind. The first light of dawn crept up over the horizon, softening the harsh lines of the desert. The gold rays painted the boulder in these hues of pink and orange, highlighting the cracks where the bullets had gouged into it. I examined the damage, and not just last night's frenzied shots. This rock was a canvas of violence, etched with years of reckless bullet scars. Packing up only took me a few minutes. I moved mechanically, eyes darting down to the emptiness below. I found holes in the fabric of my tent, torn clean by the shots that could have found me in the dark. Lucky me. The word felt hollow in my mouth, a bitter aftertaste. The descent down was grueling, every step an invitation for some kind of final shot, a sudden yell. The desert lay mute, its secrets buried beneath the sun-baked earth. When I reached that same gravel lot, my heart sank. My car, a trusty old sedan, was gutted. Tires flattened, windows shattered, paint gouged by rounds. The desert had claimed it too. My report to the authorities was a blur of questions and clipped answers, radio static and flashing lights. Cops swarmed the site, combing for shells, piecing together the chaos of the night. The investigation stretched on, each day a reminder of those blinding muzzle flashes and the laughter. But they found nothing. No leads, no names, just the whispers of those who came out at night with guns and adrenaline. Weeks passed before a call finally came in. They'd caught them, kids, barely even out of their teens, bored and armed with a sense of invincibility that only comes from stupidity. They'd come out there again firing at the rock, laughing in the face of their own recklessness. This time an officer had seen them, requested backup. The arrest was clean, the shock of it all sudden and brutal, or at least so I was told. Lots of the locals to that community pressed charges, and those kids and their families had to pay a lot. Eventually, I did get reimbursed. They paid for the tires, the windows, the tow fees. But that night, in that boulder, it's etched into my memory more deeply than the bullets that scarred my car. I haven't been back since, and the city lights are just a little brighter now, and the mountains just a little darker.